Good afternoon. This is such a wonderful turnout. And Sean, it's because of the kind of guy you are. We sent out one quick message around the first week in September, and boom, it just erupted. Almost all of you responded within a day or two. We didn't have to send out a reminder, or as you could see, we wouldn't be able to fit everybody in here. So we are so pleased that we could come together and celebrate you today. So first of all, let me say that red is not normally my color, but I wore red for you today, Sean. What is the Distinguished Service Award? It's an award that was created by the Ontario former Parliamentarians to recognize distinguished service, and it recognizes exceptional career contributions and or achievements by former members of the Ontario legislature. And I don't have to tell you the kind of legacy that Sean Conway is leaving behind, and this certainly fits under that category. So just to tell you who some of the other honorees have been: Premier Bill Davis, Bob Nixon, Roy McMurtry, Stephen Lewis, Dr. Betty Stevenson, Lynn MacLeod, Margaret Birch, and 2 years ago we honored Bob Ray, and last year we honored David Warner. So you're part of a really nice little group there, Sean. And what we're going to do next is hear from people that have some interesting stories to tell about you. And I just want to say, make them as interesting as you would like. So I'm not going to keep jumping up and down, so I'll ask the three speakers just to follow each other. So we'll hear from Phil Gillies first, then Dave Cook, and then the Honorable David Peterson. So I welcome Phil Gillies.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dear friends, you may have seen me stride up here so confidently without any notes. This is not a tribute to my impeccable memory. I left them at home. It's quite the reverse, actually. But Sean, think about it. I have no script. Every word I say about you is coming straight from the heart. And as one of my mentors once said, the most important thing in politics is sincerity. If you can fake that, you can fake anything. But I actually did scribble a few things down. But I'm seriously just delighted to be here to pay tribute to Sean and to join my friends Premier David and Dave Cook. Many, many fond memories. I became aware of Sean before I was ever elected, when I worked in Premier Davis's office back in the late 70s. There were a handful of members whose oratory was such that if you were a staffer and you could get away, that you knew one of these people was speaking, if you could get away to get to the gallery and catch even part of their speech, you would do it. And I guess in the last half century, I think of Stephen Lewis, Darcy McHugh, and Sean, and a couple of others. And of course you, David. Keeping an eye on, you never know, there are Senate seats up there. Back in those days, I actually think the 1980s was really the tail end of the era when great oratory was prized in the legislature. And with all respect to the members today, back in our day, the best speakers didn't read. They didn't read from extensive notes. They didn't read from scripts. And I remember a speaker like Sean, he knew what he wanted to say when he got up. Might have 3 or 4 notes on a file card to prompt him, but he was able to express very eloquently what it was he wanted to say, and was very, very much worth listening to. After I was elected, and we were in the House together, I watched with great fascination as Sean would get into question period. And his questions were really something. They were really something to see. Because again, he didn't get up and ask the first question and have the supplementary written down and sort of go back to the script afterwards. He listened to the initial question and then surgically took apart the minister with his supplementary. This was wonderful to watch until I went into cabinet. And then it wasn't fun at all, because when I would go into question period in the Miller government, there were three things I thought about going in. Are my great big oversized aviator glasses on straight? Is my puffy 80s hair in place? And is Sean Conway going to ask me a question? Because if that's coming, I would rather just slide off my seat onto the floor. Thankfully, that never happened, for which I'm very grateful. So, an anecdote, because Judy did say anything goes, so here we go. There was one year when members' expenses were tabled. And one of my colleagues, I'm not out to embarrass anyone, so let's call him Fred. Fred's mileage expenses were such that a very quick calculation indicated that he would have had to be driving his car 4 hours a day, 365 days of the year to rack up that much in mileage. Fred, I think on the advice of the Premier's office, disappeared for a couple of weeks. It was in all the newspapers, and as we trooped into the House the next day and took our seats, the opposition members with great glee were all calling out, "Where's Fred? Where's Fred?" The best heckle on that occasion was Jim Bradley's. As Jim yelled out, as people yelled, "Where's Fred? Where's Fred?" Jim yelled out, "He's out driving his car." Which I actually think was one of my favorite heckles from all my years at Queen's Park. But the other thing with Sean is, even when he wasn't talking, his face is an open book. You could tell what he was thinking at any given point from the facial expression, whether he was bored, whether he was disapproving, whether he thought something was funny. And all through the Fred mileage debate, Sean sat very, very subdued and didn't contribute to the mayhem at all, which I thought was a little unusual. So after question period, we happened to run into each other in the hallway, and I said, "Sean, I was surprised you didn't pile on about Sean's mileage." And Sean looked at me and said, "Fred is my cousin." And then he said, "You know, Phil, sometimes discretion is the better part of valor." I've never forgotten that. 1985 was a critical juncture in Ontario politics, because after 42 years of wonderful Tory rule, we had such a close election result in 85 that it became an open question as to who was in fact going to be forming a government, who the lieutenant governor would favor that. There was a team from each party that entered into negotiations. Sean, you led the Liberal team, as I recall. Oh, it was Bob, but you were on the team. And the Tory team was led by my dear late friend Larry Grossman. The NDP team, I'm thinking Ross McClellan. Yeah. And anyway, we went through that exercise, and the lieutenant governor decided that the Liberal leader, David Peterson, would be forming the next government under a 2-year agreement with the NDP, who would not vote to defeat the government for 2 years. Sean then inherited the hottest cabinet post at the time, which was education. The hottest issue of the day back then was the extension of full funding to separate schools, which up to that point had only received full funding to the end of grade 10. Then Premier Davis, after years of the Tories saying we wouldn't extend full funding, reversed himself and said we would extend the funding through to the end of high school. We introduced the policy, but it fell upon the new government to implement it. And talk about a hot button. It wasn't helped at the time when the Anglican Bishop of Toronto said what we were doing was akin to Nazism. You always know you're in trouble when they drop the N-word. And Sean, as education minister, had to shepherd that policy, very controversial policy, through the House, which he did with great aplomb, especially when it came out that the bureaucracy had grossly underestimated the cost of implementing the policy. That never happens. No. And, but he saw it through, some scars, but got through it nonetheless. Sean was a great parliamentarian. I've tried to touch on a few of the elements that I believe made him a great parliamentarian. He was one of the best orators, one of the best analysts of policies as they came forward. He had tremendous wit. His administrative skills were first rate. I don't remember in my years at Queen's Park really encountering many members who had all of the skills and abilities that Sean had. He left a mark here that, well, we recognize all these years later. So Sean, congratulations. This is most deserved. Thank you very much.
Now for the truth. Yeah, I got to put glasses on too. First of all, I want to thank the organizers for today for asking me to participate. It's required me to think, well, as much as I can remember over the last number of years. But at first I thought, my God, Sean, next year it'll be your 50th anniversary of your first election. I was elected a couple of years later and joined you in '77, and it didn't take long for me. We were both youngsters. You were older than me by 1 year. What a tough questioner you were, and my first recollection was in committee. Because back then, committees actually did a lot more work than they do now, and because the news bureaus were large, things got covered out of, even estimates. When we'd be doing estimates for ministries that were important and under, like ComSoc was a big one, they got reported in the Globe. I forget the woman's reporter, her name. She eventually went out west, but I mean, there were front page stories that came, yes. No, it'll Google it, somebody. But between the Toronto Star and the, yes, Barbara Yaffe. So those stories got covered and estimates mattered, and we worked like heck as individual MPPs to learn the estimates, researched, studied them, knew the questions. So committees were great, and I saw right away Sean in committee a couple of times as a tough questioner, an informed questioner, and I kind of thought to myself, holy crap, I'm like just a year younger than him, and he's like a veteran. I'll never be able to achieve that, but I felt at that time, and as I look back, that I was lucky to be elected at that time too. Bill mentioned Stephen Lewis, and I was only in the House with him for about a year and a half because in '77 he announced that he was leaving as leader. But I mean, the questions and how he could handle the House, There were others especially interesting. Beth Stevenson, I don't remember her as an orator as more as the Queen heckler. She was great. I can still hear her when you'd be asking a question or something, and she'd say, "Oh, Sean," and then she'd just go on. Jim Renwick was interesting to listen to. He always spoke like a lawyer, but when he was doing legislation, it was analytical. It was something. Pat Lawler was somebody I enjoyed listening to too. Somebody that not everybody would necessarily recall, but from down my way, I always enjoyed in the evening sessions. Sometimes Dick Rustin would give a speech. And it was like a good country speech. It was good. He was part of the, I guess, what you would call the blue Liberals, I mean, the Southwestern Ontario Liberals. But it was fun. And Darcy McHugh, oh my God, I mean, somebody asking him a tough question, and he'd get up and he'd be yelling like hell and giving and then he'd sit down and he'd just have a big smile on his face and laugh. And Larry Grossman, I remember always walking the back benches and talking to the back benches because he was thinking at some point there's going to be a leadership race. Then there was the 1985 deal. I disagree a little bit with Phil. There was never a question of who was going to be the government. And it wasn't the lieutenant governor that made the decision. It was the legislature that made the decision by defeating the government. I think if our parties had, if the NDP had somehow made a deal with the Conservatives at that point, that would have been the end of the NDP. But it was an exciting time for all of us. And Sean, of course, you were on that team. And I agree with Phil. You got the toughest post. And so some of it was the public stuff you'd think of, but also I remember as a cabinet minister having to put together some legislation sometimes. Like in mine, I think was one of the most complicated was rent control. So it would, and I think your legislation would be more complicated. People just sort of think, oh, the lawyers write up the legislation. You sit there for hours answering questions about the detail of the legislation, what you want here, what you want there. It's very, very tough. And if you make a wrong decision in some of those areas, it can blow up in your face. And you did a great job of pulling that bill together. And then there were people like Doug Raycroft and Steve Offer and me and others that had to go on that damn committee. From one end of the province to the other end, we had morning sessions, afternoon sessions, evening sessions. I don't know how many, you probably at the beginning were with this for a bit. Saturdays. Well, I remember one in particular, and that was in this room, and it was Archbishop Garnsworthy. Richard Johnson was the chair of the committee. I was the vice chair. Richard missed a lot of the sessions because he had some health issues. And I had to chair that session. And Archbishop Garnsworthy takes his chair, and I think it was Margaret Marlin that said, "Sir, how should we refer to you?" And he said, "What do you call Carter?" "I think we call him Your Excellency." "Well, that's good enough for me." So we got through 85 to 87, which was a wonderful time. I mean, I would have preferred that it was us that was the government and you guys were the partners the other way, but it wasn't that way. But still, it was a breath of fresh air. It needed to happen. I remember you guys had that when you were sworn in. It was outside. It was a beautiful day. It just felt like a new Ontario had come into a new age. And a lot was accomplished from 85 to 87. And then after 87, I will admit, Sean, we kind of misbehaved a few times. And then you brought in these rule changes that destroyed democracy. But as the opposition House leader, I was very calm. And anyway, it happened, and we got through all of that. But then we formed a government, and I wasn't the first House leader that was appointed by Bob. I was second. And there was a decision because the opposition was just being ridiculous. So we had to bring in rule changes. So I brought in some rule changes, and I came into the House, and and oh my God, Sean got up speaking, and it took me like 5 seconds to know he was upset with me. And it went on and on and on and on. My staff, my chief of staff in particular, took some of the one-liners, and he still uses them when he sees me because he thinks they're so funny. But anyway, I was in therapy for several years to get over that. And then I told my staff member, Richard, a few weeks ago, I said, I'm going to be speaking at Sean Conway's award. And he said, oh, well, the next morning I wake up and he sent me the whole frickin' speech by email. I reread it and I had to call my therapist again. However, the one little story, after the 1995 election, I was closer to the end. So I think it was after I had left the legislature. And I was living up at Yonge and Eglinton. But I still had to come down here because I was doing some work in the Ministry of Education. And I was taking the subway. I was going to take the subway. I walk up to Yonge Street and I see the Sun box. And there it is, pictures of Sean and I on the front page. Now, some of you might remember that Mike Harris had brought in a change in the pension plan, and he got rid of the gold-plated pension plan. No. But some of us, because we had contributed for so many years, had to be properly compensated. Well, the Sun, anyway, I won't go any further, but I will just tell you that what I did was I went back to my condo and I drove to the office that day. There was no way I was going to be in the... And then I was fortunate enough with Sean and Janet Ecker that we were on the TVO show, on Steve's show, for a few years. I forget how many years exactly it was. And, you know, not wanting to sound like Trump, but we became the best political panel in all of Canada and ever in the history of Canada. And there was times, though, that we would get to issues, and because Sean has so much history in his brain, he'd take the issue and then he'd start talking, and Janet would look at me and I'd look at her, and we'd just roll our eyes and say, okay, maybe the next show we'll get to talk. But it was fun being on that panel. We even got some gigs outside of that we were invited to go to and be the political panel. We were good, and I thought we were just hitting our height, and then Steve fired us. Anyway, that's. I just want to tell you, Sean, that I think you're so worthy of this award, and I'm so happy that I've been able to come here and speak, and I'm very happy to call you my friend. Congratulations.
This, for me, is sort of a Proustian experience of partaking of the Madeleine and looking around this room and so many people of whom I have so many, many happy memories. And David and Phil have evoked some great stories from the past and some great players at Queen's Park. But my favorite quip of Sean's, and he was the best, is when he called Betty Stevenson Bismarck in a skirt. And it just captured everything that we all thought, but only he wasn't afraid to say. When Joyce phoned me to speak, I must say I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time to see so many old friends. I could talk about all of you. And I have stories on all of you. But when I was asked, I said immediately yes, I would come and speak about, let me say, my dear friend Sean, because I owe him a great deal. And I guess I have such affection for Sean. We were elected in 1975. Here was this kid, not only never had a job before, but he'd never shaved before. And he was elected, this noisy kid from the Valley. And I've learned a lot about the Valley from Sean. I'm not saying everybody in the Valley is strange, but a hell of a high percentage, a hell of a high percentage of the people in the Valley are strange. I don't know, is the air or what it is, or the fact that the Valley is run by the Murrays, the Yakubuskis, and the Conways. I don't know what it is, but I got to know him. Then I was young, and I was the only guy in the legislature that knew less than he did. Don't forget, when we got elected in 1975, it was a very strange election. And coming from London, I represented an urban breakthrough. All 3 seats in London went to the Liberals. And the Liberals didn't win any other seats anywhere else. And this is after great expectations in that election. But there was a new crop of people came in, and we were all getting to know each other. And I start again by saying I knew almost nothing. I remember the very first caucus meeting. Sean, I think it was in this room. You've got a better memory than I do. And Nixon resigned. And I walked out of this room, and Charlotte Montgomery from the Globe and Mail was there. She stuck a microphone in my face and said, "Are you going to run for leader?" I said, "My God, I don't even know where the washroom is in Queen's Park." But I did run for leader, because in those days you didn't have to know a hell of a lot. And I was, it was an education for me about this province. It was a rapid education, that leadership campaign. I traveled everywhere with the help of the support of a whole bunch of wonderful people that I worked with, including Sean. And I traveled the Valley with Sean, and he knew every single person in the Ottawa Valley. But not only that, who they were married to, and their uncle and their cousin. He knew every fence post in the place. And boy, when you think of him as some kind of urban intellectual, that's completely wrong. He is a back road politician like nobody I have ever participated with in my life. And his infectious love for people and for history and for situations, the ability to see humor in damn near anything, made him infectious. So we traveled, and Stuart was the leader, and we went through a couple of elections. We were both sitting in the opposition there with all the frustrations that would involve. But I remember then, as when I became leader after that, when things were grim for the Liberal Party, and trust me, they were grim quite a bit. You would just say to Sean, go and wind up something. Go into the House, go say something. Just make a speech. Now, Dave Cook was wrong about one thing, if I may say. You talked about his ability to be spontaneous. Let me tell you, Conway was like Churchill. He worked hardest on the spontaneous speeches. And they were always brilliant, but it was with such grace and such ease. He achieved the highest art on earth, which is the art of concealing art. And nobody knew how much he worked and how good he was at doing that. And that rare ability to combine historical illusion, insights into people, back concession politics, deep understanding of policy, plus being, if I may say, a bit of a ham, combining all that into one of the finest orators in the history of this province. I used to call him the illegitimate son of Farquhar Oliver. Now, you guys have never heard of Farquhar Oliver. He was even better than all you guys mentioned before. And I agree with you, when we aggregate the greatest speakers in this, orators in the history of Ontario, at least from my perspective, Stephen was obviously there. I would have included Stuart Smith, by the way, who was a brilliant orator on a number of occasions. And just after today, I'm including Phil Gillies in that. And so that's four, but Sean was there in spades. So from my point of view, I went through the 82 leadership and ended up not knowing if we'd won anything or whether it was a poisoned chalice. But it was a heady time, and there's a sense of inevitability that the Tories were going to go on forever. They're like an old shoe. They kind of just were kind of comfortable. But we, and Sean in all his optimism, was along on that ride, and we put together a situation to present to the people of Ontario in 1985. Now, not everybody had faith in that. You'll recall that four people quit and ran away and ran for, in the 1984 federal election. And a few other guys. We lost J. Earl McEwen, I think, to you guys, and thank you, we owe you one on that. But there was a few others who, should we say, walked with their feet and didn't have real faith in that situation. No, I did, but I was a diminishing minority of one. But Sean was always there. Sean was never once, and you ask why I have such deep affection for this guy, always there, always loyal, always positive, and always honest. And it's not easy to do this. And when I told Shelley I was speaking today, she said, my wife loves you because you were so kind to her on all occasions. It's not an easy job. It's not an easy job being leader of Her Majesty's Loyal Opposition. As a matter of fact, it is probably the worst job on earth because you're always wrong no matter what happens, and you're subject to so much advice, and everybody else can do it better. But Sean was always there all of the time to help me carry those burdens. And then when we kind of lucked in with help of, well, we owe you guys one, thank you very much, in 1985, I sat at Queen's Park and I knew we were going to form the government. There's a certain inevitability to all those things. The only question for us was not to blow it. And how do you conduct these negotiations? And I asked Sean, in whom I had great faith in, and he had, let me add, I think it was obvious today, great relationships. He didn't promote hatred, and even his enemies liked him, and he can be charming 95% of the time. And along with Ian Scott and Bob Nixon, and that was our negotiating team, and we sat there and knowing this would happen. But parallel to that, I was seeing this situation that I said, we knew we were going to form the government, and we knew the most contentious bill was Bill 30. I went to, no, Bill 30. I went to Sean well before we were sworn in and said, Sean, assuming we're sworn in, and I believed we would be, the most contentious bill would be the funding bill. I'm going to appoint you Minister of Education. I want you to know now, and I had never done that to anybody else in my life. I'd never gone out and promised a cabinet job to anybody. Said, I want you to start thinking about that because we've got to get that right. And I think both David and Phil alluded to this. It was arguably the most complicated piece of legislation. As complicated, let me not compare it, as anything that ever has come along. Don't forget there were court references, there was issues about teachers, whether they had to be Catholics. It was fraught with history. This goes back to the Constitution, 1867, which is the BNA Act. It goes through, litigated hundreds of times, including the history of Ian Scott's grandfather had litigated that bill. And there was references to both the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. Ian was the counsel on that. But this team, all orchestrated by Sean, and managing the legislature. And when it went to the legislature, in my recollection, it was a vote of 117 to 1. Only Norm Sterling voted against that. But there were heroic performances by people like Richard Johnson and others. Steve and Doug were on, and these guys, and I think, David, you were on that committee, who understood the gravity of that situation, understood it was historic in all of its complexity, and responded to the leadership of Sean, who knew all pieces of that particularly complex file. So I think we owe him a great deal. Others will speak of his oratory, because he was the best. I would cancel anything just to go and listen to him, even if he was making no sense at all. To me, it made a whole bunch of sense. Then, Sean has had a very distinguished career post-politics, even though he sat for, 28 years, 27, 28 years, which is stunning in itself. And the fact he did not go completely mentally ill in that period of time. But he has made so many contributions to young people. Sean is a custodian of so much knowledge that spills out of his ears. His mind is like a pinball machine. It's kind of racing around and all that stuff. You start talking about this, and he starts talking about that, and talks about this. And the problem is everything's interesting, and it's all kind of fun. But he never stops either. And he just keeps going with all this stuff. And boy, you can imagine what a treasure trove that is for the young people to whom he has been exposed. He's taught at Queen's, he's taught at Ryerson, Metropolitan, he's taught at U of T, at St. Mike's, and so many other places. And he enthuses these kids with his love of learning, his scholarship, his humanity, and his anecdotal knowledge. He's got more stories. He has gossip on all of you. And let me tell you, if he chooses one, I've always thought Sean should write the definitive book. I don't know why he hasn't. And I think we should encourage him to do this. Take his perspective as a practitioner, loved by all, with massive accomplishments. Boy, it's something we should all aspire to. So I just want to say thank you for inviting me. I'm happy to have this chance just to express my deep respect for Sean and my deep affection. One of the problems with being the first minister is far too much power in our system, to be perfectly frank. You think about it, and first minister can easily get discombobulated because everybody defers to them, everybody wants something, and they have the power to make or break the lives of a lot of people around them. You're this, you're that, I'm kicking you out of this. And it's one person decides on all of these things. And you need help when you're in that position. And Sean, who I trusted with virtually every big decision I ever made, and that's not easy. I want to repeat, that's not easy when you're first minister, because you hold so many sensitive secrets. I trusted him. And for that, I will be eternally grateful personally. And for all of his enormous skills, we should all be enormously grateful that we've had a chance to interface with one of the great parliamentarians I have ever met.
Some of you are old enough to remember the late, great Adlai Stevenson, an important governor of Illinois and twice the Democratic nominee for the presidency of the United States. He failed both times running against General Eisenhower. But late in his career, Stevenson was being introduced very, very generously. And when he got to the microphone, he said, and I quote, "I learned a long time ago in politics that flattery is fine so long as the person does not inhale." So given the previous three speakers, I'll try to be Bill Clinton and not inhale. Thank you all. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to Joyce and the OAFP for putting this wonderful party on such a glorious fall day. Thank you to Joyce particularly, Joyce Savaline. Joyce, she is the most delightful person with whom to work. And I want to thank her very, very much. I want to thank my family, my sister, my sister-in-law. Two of my nieces are here, all of them female, and many friends. Terry Hall, whose father, someone I was delighted to serve with between 1975 and 1981. Ross Hall, MPP for Lincoln, a real mentor to me because Ross actually knew something. He'd served in the Navy during the war. He created a real business that employed a lot of people and capital in the Niagara Peninsula, and you just used to listen to me and go, good God, what did you ever do besides gas on about every subject under the sun? I look at former staff members. Susanna's got to be laughing when who said it? Did you say, David? Somebody said that, oh, he was always so administratively in charge. Sue Hannah's here. She was my ministerial chief of staff. Elaine Tracy, who ran my constituency office. People like the gentleman with the very robust beard. I should tell you, a member of the Ontario Court of Justice now, but 40 years ago, was one of the best research assistants I ever knew, thanks to Stuart Smith and Charles Beer for hiring him. And the list goes on. Matt Lombardi, my old research assistant at Queen's. And those of you who are, and Nan Thompson. Man, Nan Thompson is here. Nan put up with me in the legislative office. And she not only worked for me, but she worked for a time with David Peterson, I think before he was in government. Is that not correct? I forget the chronology. So to family, to friends, former staff, and former colleagues, what can I say but thank you so much for organizing this, paying your $15 to come, and special thanks to the three of you who spoke so generously in your remarks. And maybe I'll start there because I want you to know I brought my clock. Blessed are the brief, for they might be invited again. I can see Chris Hodson looking at the door. I said, Conway, I got to be out of here. 2 o'clock. Where's my friend? Is he already departed? No, Chris is here. At any rate, and if you have to leave, and I'm not going to be that long, but so many things were said, some of which I really do want to underscore. David Peterson, you told me something I didn't know. I remember the early days after May 2nd, 1985, when we were looking at that hung parliament. And David and I agreed that the time had come to do something. And if we were going to do something, we better act fast, because principles of responsible parliamentary government is that, once a government meets Parliament and gets one vote of confidence, and that can be something as simple as an adjournment motion, that government has a right to ask for dissolution. So if you want to be absolutely certain that His Honor, the Governor, is going to have very constrained options, we've got to defeat the Miller government at first instance. And then David did two things. He said, we're going to form a little committee to start talking to the NDP. And I won't get into any of that detail. It did become pretty clear pretty quickly that that deal was going to be done. But then he said about the same time, and he didn't use the words he used up here about 10 minutes ago, he said, Conway, I want you to go and see Ed Stewart, the formidable Dr. Edward E. Stewart, the alter ego of one William Grenville Davis. Very smart, long experienced senior public servant. Mr. Davis is deputy at the Premier's office for most of his time as Premier and some of his time as Minister of Education and University Affairs. And I don't know anybody. The Davis-Stewart combination had more collective understanding of educational policy and politics than any other two people alive in the latter half of the 20th century. And I said, what do you want me to go and see Ed Stewart about? He said, just go. There was none of this Minister of Education stuff at all. He said, go and see Dr. Stewart. He has something for you. So off I go. And I had, of course, like the smart-ass oppositionist I was, said rather tartly on occasion that Ed Stewart didn't always, in my view, honor the distinction between the public service and the political function. So I walk in, boy, did I feel like I better behave myself in here. And he had a document. And I said, what's this? He said, well, you're going to start taking ministerial briefings. Oh. And I think he said something like, your boss and Premier Miller, I think, have had some conversations about the school question. We're now into mid-May 1985. Mr. Davis, the year before, had outlined the policy and the schedule that was to be followed, and the beginning of implementation was going to be September 1st, 1985. We're now 3 months away from that startup date, and there's no legislation. And now, gone is a majority government and a very unstable-looking minority parliament. So I sort of said, well, I guess I better do as I'm told, so I'll sign this. And he said, now you understand what you're signing. It's essentially a minister's oath of confidentiality, and you will start as soon as we can arrange them. And they started very soon thereafter, taking briefings as you would as a minister. And I can't remember whether I even took it up with my boss at the time, because he consciously chose not to tell me. What I do remember were two things about that. And I want to just say to those of you who've never been in government, but your day may come, and if you're like I was after 10 fairly active years in the opposition and a very good education in Bill Davis's Ontario, I knew the square root of bugger all about how government actually works. I mean, it was stunning what I did not know about the executive department of government. So I start taking these briefings. Oh my God. Oh my God. How, wait till the caucus hears about this. These cost estimates. And of course, we're a minority parliament, and I knew how people kind of felt about this. You know, the best training I got for government, especially thinking about my first term, I spent a glorious year, 1974, 75, at Queen's University, living in the 19th century, in the Union period, pre-Confederation Canada, Lower Canada, Upper Canada particularly. And there was one subject that I really drilled into, was why was the subject of denominational schooling so fissiparous, so the third rail of politics from almost the beginning of what we know as Canada to the late part of the 20th century. And one briefing followed after the next, and Ian Scott had just got elected, and Ian, if you remember, Ian was just he was a very bright, lively, interesting guy, and of course the provisions in the British North America Act that really define the separate school provisions that we were acting under really were the Scott Act of 1863. And that was the legislation that was pursued and enacted by his great-grandfather. At any rate, so I would go down. Ian needed a place. He just elected. I don't have an office. Well, who's going to be where? So I said, Ian, just hang out in my office, you know. So he'd be there when I'd come back from these briefings. And I'd have to talk to somebody. I'd signed an oath. I thought, well, I can't not trust Scott. And I mean, after about 3 of these briefings, I thought, this is just going to be the end of us. We're going to be a stillborn government. Wait till the crew hears about this. Anyway, we had promised that we would introduce legislation. If we formed a government, we would introduce legislation on a priority basis. We took office on the 26th of June, 1985, and we introduced the legislation, I think, on the 2nd of July, 1985, 6 days later. I remember Scott and I going to a press conference to speak to our legislation, and in my mind, all I could see was a big chunk of Swiss cheese. I thought, well, the press gets at me, and of course, I thought, well, they will know at least something about some of this stuff. Well, they didn't really understand much more than your general press person, and quite frankly, it was pretty specific stuff in some respects. But what a start to my ministerial career. So thank you very much for not telling me that I was going to have, and this is going to sound a little pompous, and I've thought about writing about this because I didn't keep notes, but I just remember there was about a month when I was effectively a minister, but I didn't belong to any government. And with every briefing, I thought, I don't think I want to belong to a government if this is going to go where I think it's going to go. Happily, it got resolved, but it was an experience that was like none other in my entire life. And I say to members here, people who imagine that they might like to be in Parliament, you know, I repeat, David said something of the same. I don't know how I could have been here for 10 years and known so little about government, how it worked. And I'd spent a fair bit of time studying it, but I didn't understand from studying it, places like Queen's and Wilfrid Laurier University, that, well, Pakin and I are in the same cabinet, and he's the Minister of Health, and I'm the Minister of Education. And when he says, yes, I agree with your funding request to Ms. Lankin as Treasury Board Secretary, that's just to be polite. He has no intention of supporting me when push comes to shove, because there's only so many dollars and health needs it all. You know? And just like water polo, everything looked calm above the line, but if you had an underwater camera, it was a completely different experience. I forget who said it. You know, you're very kind about you know, my behavior in the legislature, but you're forgetting some important deviations. Stephen Lewis said to me one day, I'll never forget this. Lewis was so good on a couple of things. I met him first in the Legislative Library, and he said, do you know what this place is? I said, yeah, I do know what it is. He said, take it from me. You want to get to know this place and the resources in here and get to use them. And he couldn't have been more right. But he also said something else I remember. He said, you know, because like a lot of young, smart-ass guys, and I was certainly in that category, you just are inclined to be too partisan for your own good. Once you get elected, you kind of need to be partisan, you know, because you're carrying a flag and you're in a contest over 40 days with other people. But once you enter Parliament, it's, you know, it's to discuss. It's to compromise. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done unless you have a massive majority government. And we had one of those, and David and I remember how that went. So try, again, to, and I'd say this to the OAFP, and it's hard to do, but try to create opportunities where members on all sides act as though someday they may get the summons to government. If you've been here, I was here 10 years. And what was really valuable for me, and nobody touched on it, but I was a child of minority government. 75 to 81, 2 back-to-back minorities after 32 years of what I call the horse latitudes of democratic government in the colonies. You know, Ontario, prosperous place, good government, basically. But, you know, the CCF NDP played a very important role in keeping Toryism in Ontario from being what often it wanted to be, real red-blooded conservatism, because the minute it tended in that direction, the minute they started to lose support. So I think it is really important to find ways and means of making people understand, as members of the legislature, the easy part is opposition. Anybody can get up and gas on about what's wrong. There was a famous speaker of the American Congress, Sam Rayburn, and he was there when Taft was president, and he left when his acolyte, Lyndon Johnson, was becoming president. And somebody asked him on his way back to die in Texas in the early 60s, so what main lessons would you say to somebody coming in to take your place, Sam? Well, he said, I'll tell you one of the lessons from 60 years in politics. And what's that? Well, any jackass, he said, can kick a barn door down. But in my experience, it takes a carpenter to build one. And Jeff Simpson wrote a wonderful book called The Discipline of Power. If you've never read it, you should read it. Because in our system in Canada, both provincially and nationally, there's been a failure at the fundamental level of change. The parliamentary system assumes that from time to time, a responsible group of ins goes out to be refreshed on the opposition bench, and a responsible group of outs comes in to accept the seals of office and to have a different look at problems that to the previous administration might have looked, you know, impossible, insuperable, or whatever. Well, really, Ontario has liked one-party dominance. The Liberals governed for 32 consecutive years from 1872 till 1905, where they just fell under the weight of their own maladministration, and the Conservatives governed for most of the 20th century. David Peterson saw something in Frank Miller I didn't see. I mean, the opportunity that I saw in my time here was 1975. It's one of the reasons why I decided not to go to Duke University and do a PhD in history, but rather take a run at something that almost caused my mother to have a bird, was that it looked like the dynasty was ending. And it didn't. And we ended up with not one, but 2 minority parliaments. Now, I'm going to try to be very careful when I make this following observation. The second minority parliament was not at all expected by, I suspect, just about everybody in the Davis administration and virtually all of the gang in opposition. Oh, God, well, Davis has learned the lessons that he didn't seem to understand in the later part of his first mandate, where he was massively supported by his 1971 election result. So, yep, there's going to be an election, and he's got 51 seats, and he's going to 80 seats. 35 days later, 40 days later, he was more or less where he was when he started. Remember John Robarts on television that night, June 9th, 1977? Mr. Robarts told Fraser Kelly, how would you summarize the election, Mr. Robarts? Well, he said, I'd look at it this way. My friend, Mr. Davis, he won, but he kind of lost. Dr. Smith, he lost, but he kind of won, because the Liberals went from 3rd to 2nd place. And Stephen Lewis, well, he kind of lost, and he lost, because he'd gone from 2nd to 3rd place, not by much. Now, I sometimes think I'm hallucinating these days when I'm up in the pure air of the Ottawa Valley listening to early morning news. What? Somebody with a massive parliamentary majority at midterm wants to have an early election? Wow. Well, every time is different. I mean, I don't want to walk that walk in 1990. We had a very lively discussion, and I won't break any cabinet confidentiality, but I just remember 1977 and 1990. Those are my two personal experiences with an early call, and, well, I'll say no more. I want to say back to the 75. I mean, I remember coming in here, and the environment was Davis survived, and he wasn't expected to survive. And he was able to survive because the electoral system was a real friend for him in that campaign. It was a real enemy for us. We got 5.5% more of a vote. Tories got 36, the NDP got we got 34, the NDP got 29, I think it was. There was 5 points between the Liberals and the NDP. But the NDP, and they ran a very good campaign. I don't want to take anything away. Stephen Lewis ran a spectacular campaign. But with a popular vote for the NDP that went from 28.2 to 29 was about a little over 1.5%, double their seats from 19 to 38. But I'll tell you, I joined a caucus that, as David said, was not very happy because we were expected to win. We didn't even come second. We came third. But nonetheless, it was my first job. I remember my first legislative pay corresponded with my last payment from the Queen's Graduate Fund. And I was kind of looking at the two and thinking, how come my Queen's pay seemed to go further? And somebody said, well, you're paying taxes now, you fool. And not very much taxes given the non-taxed expense allowance. But I just remember the characters. Oh my God, the people that came in with me. I mean, Betty Stevenson, God bless Betty. I was here to do Betty's Distinguished Service Award. She wasn't able to be with us, but I'll tell you, and Bradley is sitting back there. Bradley was just so bad. I was bad with Betty, but Bradley was worse. He would just, because Betty, she was a lovely person. I would love to have Betty as a neighbor, as a doctor. And remember, and Floyd will remember this, that some of you, even if you were elected in 77, wouldn't have seen this. So Mr. Davis had to reorganize his cabinet. And the main event in most question periods was the new Minister of Labor, Betty Stevenson, and the Leader of the Opposition, Stephen Lewis. I remember sitting there thinking, oh my God, to be in the middle of that fire would be a very quick end to your life on this mortal coil. And of course, Betty always had the advantage. I mean, Stephen said to her one day, you know, Mr. Speaker, so many things to like about the Minister of Labor, but my favorite is that she's got such an elastic view of the truth. and Betty was like, as I once said, like a hungry trout in fly season. Anything moved on the calm water, she snapped. And what she could do, and the poor Speaker would be sitting there, whether it was Russ Rowe or John Turner or Jack Stokes. Was Jack? No, Stephen was there for, anyway. Betty would assess you medically. So, you know, hours later, somebody would come and say, do you realize what she just said about you? You know, it was not very polite, and it certainly wasn't parliamentary, but it was too late. In that first intake, of 75, there was Betty, there was Stuart Smith, who in his own kind of eclectic way was a very effective leader of the opposition. He didn't want to be leader of the opposition, but David's right, that's one of the worst jobs going, especially in Ontario provincial politics. And Stuart, in my view, did that very, very well. He was a psychiatrist, and let me tell you, I think part of the reason he won the Liberal leadership in 1976, about 4 months after that disastrous election in September 75, if we needed anything, we needed a psychiatrist. And Janus Stuksta wasn't always available. The third doctor in that intake, and most of you won't know this guy, Dr. Charles Bud Godfrey. He was only here 2 years. He was, without a doubt, one of the most remarkable human beings I have ever known. He was related, I think, to the great John Rolfe, physician, radical, part of the 1837 rebellion. He was head of rehab medicine at the Wellesley Hospital. What brought him here, I think he told me one day, he really wasn't a New Democrat. He just got swept up in the agitation over the Pickering Airport where he had a farm. But I'm telling you, to spend 5 minutes walking with Charles from the legislature to the dining room was like a full graduate program in life and humanity. And he lived, he left, he was defeated. He was really not looking to be reelected. His election was quite accidental, and he was, I think, pleased as hell to go back to full-time medicine as he did in 1977. He lived to be 105 years of age, and just an amazing guy. And one of the great things about being a member of Parliament is you meet people like this. It's a truly Chaucerian parade. Some intakes a little more interesting than others. I mean, we all had our characters. I mean, I remember getting elected and meeting Eddie Sargent, you know. I mean, God, I remember anytime I talked to Bill Davis in later life, the one person he always wanted to talk about was Elmer Sofa. I mean, Sofa was just so outrageous that he would never, Floyd is chuckling because he knows exactly how outrageous. But there were characters. I mean, they were just, you know, they're gone now. They wouldn't get nominated. They can't get elected, basically. But it was, in that respect, a very different kind of place. Again, I think of that intake. Women, and we were still very, very underrepresented with women. We had elected Margaret Campbell in the by-election where she beat Roy McMurtry in 1973. But the 75 intake brought people like Betty. I mean, Betty, and she went to the immediate front of the line, and she was a very powerful minister from day one. But the NDP had people like Marion Bryden, quiet, but talk about a workhorse. I mean, she was an economist. She worked, she didn't make a lot of noise, although she gave many speeches, and if you wanted to learn something that might be a little statistical in its import, you went and listened to Marion. Evelyn Gigantes, another journalist who threw herself into the energy debate with great gusto and effect. I used to watch her and think, and Bob Nixon would always make some comment about, oh, don't ask me, I'd have to go and talk to Evelyn to get the answer. And that's how a lot of us felt. I mean, she really knew that information was really important if you were going to be an effective, informed minister or a ministerial critic. Let me just quickly move along here. I want to say that in 75, we expected government, and we didn't get it. I'm going to disagree again with my friend David Peterson. 85? Far too generous. He kept going on. I'm telling you, if they choose Frank Miller, that's my opportunity. I didn't see it that way. He was right, and I was wrong. And I liked Frank, and it was well, I won't get into too much of that. But I remember December 13th, 1984. It was the blackest day, I think, of my entire time here. Because as David said, 5 members of the legislature sought election to the federal parliament, and 2 of them got elected. Don Boudreau from Prescott Russell, and Michael Cassidy, and Sheila Copps. That's right. And then in the subsequent by-elections, provincially, we lost 2 seats that we'd held. Now, you know that if you start losing seats that you'd held for a number of years, that's not a good omen with the provincial election 4 to 6 months away. The anniversary date for the election would have been spring of 85, and that's exactly when it occurred. I tell you, I was not nearly as David described. I thought, I cannot. I mean, this permanent opposition life is not good for your mental health. And I was just about ready to go and jump off a bridge. But my friend, who spoke just before I did, and his senior staff looked at themselves and said, to quote the late Colonel Breithaupt, I guess we may as well be hanged for a sheep as a lamb. And they took a very well-developed group of policies that were not only well-developed but relevant on issues like the human rights agenda that was becoming very important, gay rights was emerging as a major issue, environmental protection, some of the breaches in Medicare. So let's get off the fence and let's actually say something direct, understandable, and relevant to the electorate. And they did, and also wrote a policy on the separate school question that, as the minister who had to enforce it, because I had virtually nothing to do with its architecture, was extraordinarily helpful. We were able to take that, go into an election, and it was a hung parliament. But with a very well-defined set of policies, much better and more than we would ever have done in the past, and the NDP, to be perfectly frank, they had the golden boy from Ottawa, R.K. Ray QC, very formidable intellect, and with some further development went on to very considerable renown, with perhaps a little more ecumenism than some here present might have appreciated. It made the Accord almost a cinch. And one of the things I'm going to wind up here momentarily. A great friend of mine, Ned Franks, was probably the authority on Canadian Parliament. Ned used to say, and we are a group of former parliamentarians. Ned once said, that's one of his fundamental approaches to his academic writing and research was, Parliament has 4 functions, and we are today in a parliamentary place. In the British system, those 4 functions are, 1, to make a government. That's what was done here in the spring of 1985. Usually a general election with disciplined political parties settles that question. But if you get a hung parliament, what does one do? I was stunned in 1985 by how many people, many of them in the press, had no idea what the informing logic of our system is. The voter gets to choose a parliament, but the parliament chooses a government. And parliament dismisses the government under a whole set of conditions. But one of the 4 functions are to make a government, to make it work, to make it behave, and to make an alternate government. And as an association of former parliamentarians, that last point about making an alternate government, I would hope and pray that people that have been here a few years, because they're the ones in opposition, the expectation is going to be, well, they'll have some idea of how this really works. You heard both David and I say we weren't very far up that ladder, though we'd been here for 10 years. I think he's being falsely modest. Trust me, I am not, because I had that particularly unusual circumstance. And then, of course, the third function is to make a government behave. And I don't care who it is. Johnny MacDonald once said, you give me a majority government, and not even a force of archangels could prevent me from misbehaving. Because in this system, people in the congressional system look at these parliamentary systems, and as you said, you give me a strong majority government, and I can do what few other democratic governments can do, because the parliamentary system is very efficient. You know who to blame. If they screw up, there'll be an election and kick the bums out. There's none of this diffused, well, Congress did this and the court did that and all the rest of it. I mention that because one of the things that concerns me today when I talk to members of Parliament and members of the legislature, good people all and really hardworking, I'm concerned that too many of them don't know what their job is. And I want to say this, and I was going to quote, and I'm not going to get into it. Theresa May gave a great speech about 4 months ago to the inaugural lecture, the inaugural democracy lecture, the Churchill-Attlee Democracy Lecture, where she's retiring. She's now gone to the Lords as Baron May of Maidenhead, but she was 27 years an MP in the House of Commons. She formed a government. She was Home Secretary for 6 years and party leader and Prime Minister for 3. And she just said, there's too many people around here who think that being a garden variety MP is a bad job. No, it is not a bad job. It's a really important job. Somebody's got to do it. You've got to understand what your role and responsibility is. I know everybody's got ambition. Everybody wants to be a minister. But the job of being a member of Parliament, a member of the legislature, in and of itself. I was a grad student for a year. I had a great time. But I remember when I first got here, and this was afforded to us because minority government is different. The longer you're in a majority situation, the less likely you're going to want to be interested in hearing the possibilities of Parliament. Because oppositions get pretty supine, or pretty, whatever the right word is, pretty sleepy about their prerogatives after, every election is just how big is the majority. When I was first elected, and as I say, I just come from grad school. In that first 2 or 3 years, Select Committee on Energy, chaired by Don MacDonald. There are few policy files here at Queen's Park that are more important than the energy file. One plea I would make, I've made it before, I would make it now, party leaders should there should be a permanent standing select committee where you take 2 people from each party and you put them into a situation where for 2 weeks a year, they take briefings on energy issues and options and costs. Because much of our time was in an energy surplus. We're not there anymore. And it's not as complicated as people think. But to the extent I developed any literacy, 5 years on a good select committee teaches you, if nothing else, what not to do. The second select committee was on healthcare costs and financing. I spent 6 months, whereas my friend from CAM, you were on that. Anybody else on that? Bob LG was the chairman until he went to the cabinet. That was a fascinating learning experience about the emerging issues in healthcare. I picked up the other day the 1975 Ontario budget. Do you know what the spending in Ontario was? Overall, it was about $10.5 billion. We actually ran, Steve, about a $1,630 million deficit, if that's what you consider to be net cash requirements, and I think I'm right on that. Healthcare spending in 1975 was $2.8 billion. It's now $85 billion. That's not bad, eh? What's that multiple? Let's call it 3 to 85. You're responsible for that? You have got a big deal on your hands, and you better understand what it is you're responsible for, or you're in fact going to be consumed by it, as sometimes appears to be the case watching national politics here or in the United Kingdom or certainly in the United States. When that job got finished, we were sent off to do another select committee on constitutional reform because Quebec had chosen to elect a sovereignist-oriented government. And off we went. Jim Renwick was on that committee, another one of my favorite mentors. I guess I will end by saying, I look back on this, and there were times when, I got pretty fed up. It mostly had to do with extraneous things like they kept making my constituency, the constituency I represented, just bigger and bigger. And when you start with something that's much smaller than it looks like on a map, you can get very personal in your service. But when it triples in size, that makes it much more complicated to provide that kind of service. Oh, Conway, so you're now in cabinet. You don't have any time for us on weekends. No. Well, that's what it looks like. But, it's an important job. It's a good job. I think the OAFP can do more. And this is something Theresa May said in her Churchill Athlete lecture. What other organization would have a big intake and do virtually nothing to train people about the job? Now, I think things are better. In my day, the Camp Commission made a huge change. You people today don't appreciate it, but it is the difference between day and night. But some days I get despondent and think, well, the more resources, the less people want to use them. Because why would I do that when I could go into the performance arts of question period and just look for the cut clip on CFPL News, if that's still available. And listen, some of you who know me would say, well, that's pretty precious for Conway, of all people, to say. So it was a great job. It remains a good and important job. Circumstances are very different. We're looking at the United States at circumstances that are truly gobsmacking. May, in her lecture, raises very serious concerns about the state of democracy in the United Kingdom. If you want to read an interesting book, I brought it, Rory Stewart's book about how not to be a politician. What has gone down in the mother of all parliaments, 2010 to 2020, it is a stunning commentary on the greatest of all our parliaments. And people like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, how on earth did they ever get elevated to leadership and first ministership? I mean, just beyond belief. The spectacle that we watch nightly in Washington or Butler, Pennsylvania, or Oakland, California, and my spidey sense says that 3 weeks out, he may just pull this off. And if he pulls this off, last time will be a very meek prologue to next time. So democracy, parliamentary democracy or congressional democracy, does not survive on its own, and that's why I was delighted to be here today to thank you for your lovely lunch and your very nice recognition, but to say that journey is never ended. And I'm not very close to the situation anymore, but sometimes when you think you're about to enter a horse latitudes, you're actually heading over Niagara Falls. And so good luck with all of that. Thank you very much. And I'm sorry to go on for as long as I did.
Sean, that was absolutely phenomenal. Thank you, thank you, thank you. But I wondered if you could come back and join me for a minute, because we would like to offer you the Distinguished Members Prize, if you will. And this was supposed to be my friend John's, but he's hiding in the corner.
I would love a picture not only with you, but I'd also settle one maybe with the three. Yeah, there's Phil and David and David. David, you mind coming up?
I'll let you gentlemen.
Yeah, just so we just have a second.
And that's okay. I want to please thank everyone for coming out this afternoon to honor a member, to show respect for all the contributions of a member. And Sean, you're fabulous, and we really appreciate you being here. And thank you to everyone who came this afternoon. So enjoy talking to each other and having this moment together. So thank you, thank you, thank you.